could ever hope to achieve. That is not to say the French completely ignored the development of long-range strategic bombers, and indeed several commanders wholly appreciated the ability of attacking targets far beyond the range of artillery, but the heavy bombers that were in development by the end of the war were mostly a reaction to the long-range bombers that were being fielded and used by the Germans, because if Paris could be bombed by Germany, the Air Force had to field aircraft that could reply, lest they be viewed by the public as impotent. But on the whole, only a small group of officers in both the Air Force and the Army saw the potential of these long-range bombers, and because of this, they were built in very small numbers when compared to the light and medium tactical bombers that were used by the French Air Force in the last 2 years of the First World War. This application of bombing aircraft by the French had remarkably far-reaching ramifications. The very nature of a tactical aircraft implied a level of subordination of air power to land power, and for that reason, along with many others, the French victory over Germany was viewed as a complete victory by land, and that the French Air Force had been a mere side piece, a tool that helped the army do its job. And because of this, many believed that a dedicated air force would be unnecessary. On the surface, it was an argument that made some sense, as the Air Force on its own had a negligible impact on the overall outcome of the war, and it was supposed that the Air Force would just become another full-time branch of the army, much like artillery or cavalry. But unlike those two, aviation was still very much in its infancy. Aircraft were still developing. They were slow, unreliable, vulnerable, and before the war it was more or less completely untested as a military weapon. This point was argued to officers of the army by various officers of the Air Force, who appreciated that the aircraft would develop rapidly and thus have much more to offer in the future as a weapon of war, but their arguments pretty much fell on deaf ears. For the French, long-range bombing had delivered very little in the way of practical results, though the morale impact was appreciated, and after reviewing the results of the long-range bombing campaigns of Britain and France, the army was further reinforced in its views. It was agreed unanimously that aircraft should be used to aid the army in tactical operations first and foremost. They would conduct photography, reconnaissance, and artillery spotting, and then maybe, if absolutely needed, tactical bombing when required. This was an opinion that would be carried quite deep into the interwar period, and through a combination of politics, personal influence, and a healthy amount of figurative and literal bribery, the French army maintained a position of dominance in all councils on national defence, and this had a profound impact on the development and doctrine of the French Air Force, which, unlike the RAF, that became the world's first independent air force in 1918, would remain subservient to the French army well into the 1930s. It will come as a little surprise then that the most popular aircraft developed during the early 1920s were ones that conformed to the school of thinking that the army was trying to impose: reconnaissance first, tactical support second. And yet, paradoxically, the first new bombing aircraft to be produced in the interwar period, and one of the most successful of its time, was a long-range heavy bomber, the blocky, slab-sided...
The audio for this video has got nothing to do with the subject matter of the typing.
The Goliath's biggest legacy would be the impact
Sorry
that
about
it had
that.
on early commercial air travel in the opening years of the interwar period, but that is a focus for another day. As a bomber, it was initially developed in early 1918 as a response to the growing fleet of long-range aircraft that were being fielded by Germany. Though, as mentioned earlier, there was a small group of army officers who supported the development of heavy bombers, the biggest push for the development of the Goliath came from the French government and the French Navy, and obviously the French Air Force as well. The French government wanted to appease public concerns about France's lack of a heavy bomber force, as for most of the war they could field pretty much nothing that could effectively hit cities such as Essen, Frankfurt, let alone more distant targets such as Berlin, with anything more than a couple of 100 kilos of bombs, if that. Now, the French Navy were instead interested in having a heavy aircraft that could perform the role of an early torpedo bomber, as at the time they had doubts about the effectiveness, speed, and reliability of a single-engine torpedo bomber, though not too long after this, the British-built Sopwith Cuckoo would quickly do away with most of their concerns. As for the opinions of the French Air Force, they simply didn't want to be left behind in what was shaping up to be a new aerial arms race. Various aerial theorists in France, Britain, Germany, and Italy had begun to agree that a fleet of heavy bombers could seriously impact a war if used correctly, bombing an enemy's factories and denying their armies vital supplies, particularly small arms ammunition and artillery shells. Though most in the army felt that the small size of bombs and the relative inaccuracy of air attacks seen thus far basically rendered this tactic effective on paper only, the air staff were far more optimistic, or pessimistic depending on what way you look at things, and they began to draw up plans for an ambitious bombing campaign that would be launched in the spring of 1919. For this bombing campaign, they of course needed something that they did not currently possess, and that was a heavy bomber. And the aircraft that they eventually selected was one developed by the Farman brothers. Known initially as the Farman F-60, it made its first flight in October of 1918. Though it was smaller than some of the bombers that were either being developed or actively fielded by both Britain and Germany, this was the biggest military aircraft built by France thus far, in wingspan, and because of this, it quickly earned the nickname of Goliath. As initially designed, it was meant to carry a bomb load of 2,000 kilos at an average speed of 150 kilometers an hour across a range of 1,500 kilometers, which would have represented a significant upgrade in French bombing capabilities, had the war not ended a month later and had its intended engine actually been used. It was meant to be powered by a new engine that was being developed by Samson, an 18-cylinder 500 horsepower radial engine, but the development of this engine was abandoned, and the F-60 had to be flown with much weaker 9-cylinder radials that produced just 260 horsepower. Because of this, the bomb load had to be revised down to just 1,000 kilograms, and following initial flight tests where the F-60 presented stability concerns, the Army's interest in the project all but evaporated, and following the armistice, all military orders were in fact cancelled. The Goliath was then repurposed to form the backbone of the early French commercial air industry, and within just a few short years, various Goliaths were gallivanting across Europe, setting altitude records, crossing the Atlantic, and in general doing much to increase the prestige of French aviation. At this point, the Army realised that they might have been a bit hasty in rejecting the Goliath, as it was proving to be thoroughly reliable, and although they did prefer their smaller tactical aircraft, the large bomber fleets that were being fielded by Britain and Italy meant that there was a growing need for France to also possess some sort of a heavy bomber force, and interest in a military version of the Goliath was renewed in 1921. This led to the development of the Farman F-60BN2, which became the first official version of the Goliath to enter military service. Employed as a night bomber, it had a crew of 3, a wingspan of 26.5 meters, and a loaded weight of approximately 5,400 kilos. This version still made use of the less powerful 260 horsepower radial engines, and because of this, the bomb load was limited to 1,040 kilos. This was either made up of smaller bombs that were held within an internal bomb bay, or larger weapons which were suspended on racks underneath the fuselage. The military Goliath was eventually built in a number of different models, some of which eventually featured better engines, which were usually license-built Jupiter engines which had an output of approximately 380 horsepower. Approximately 200 F-60s would eventually be delivered for both the Army and the Navy, along with a batch of approximately 60 floatplane versions which were built as the F-65. Though later, more powerful versions could eventually carry up to 3 tons of payload, it wasn't in service with the Army and the Air Force for particularly long, and it was already being phased out by the mid-1920s. The naval versions, some of which pioneered torpedo bombing techniques for twin-engine aircraft, were in service for much longer, albeit this was sometimes because there was literally no other alternative for much of the decade. But as these were mostly operated as torpedo bombers rather than normal level bombers, they don't really fall within the scope of today's video. The biggest drawback of the Goliath had been its speed, or rather the lack thereof. Its loaded cruising speed was a hilariously sedate 120 kilometers an hour. Other aircraft were now emerging that were bigger and heavier than the Goliath, whilst also being significantly faster. This led to the development of the F-140 Super Goliath and the F-160 and its derivatives. The F-140 was an attempt to inject some much-needed power into the airframe, and for this, Farman used an engine of their own design, a 500 horsepower W12. 4 of them were installed in tandem pairs on the lower wing, and they drove 4-blade wooden propellers. Though it could carry 3,000 kilograms of bombs at a speed of 183 kilometers
Oh, he's still going on about bombs!
Super Goliaths would be built. By this point, its structural design was deemed as being far too outdated by the Air Force, the Goliath being made primarily out of wood rather than metal. Instead, the Air Force would place an order for a new twin-engine all-metal bomber with one of Farman's competitors, something which we'll get to shortly. This rejection prompted the modernization of the entire design, and this led to the F-160 and the F-168 in particular, of which approximately 200 would be built for the French Navy. But as these were designed as naval torpedo bombers rather than conventional bombers, we'll put them aside for the time being. Aside from the Farman F-60, there were a few other attempts at producing multi-engine bombers in the early 1920s. But none of them were quite as successful, and collectively they would...
Right, turn off the background nonsense for a moment and say, why did I go through all that? Because that's a summary of what people think about Chinese batteries on the internet, followed by Will Prowse and so on and so forth. And those people, I would say, represent very specifically the domestic self-build person. Now, I don't think the domestic self-build person is the majority of the market, frankly. I think the majority of the market will in time be commercial electrical grid system controls. And but I do think that in order to achieve the rollout, we will be putting out 48 volt 4 kilowatt hour type server units for a long time yet, because in some places the need will be to put them in densely and get the batteries in really quite tight and packed. So, and you can't take a forklift upstairs in urban environments. So you ain't going to be installing batteries the size of that lovely battery from Polynoval everywhere in the UK. What really I wanted to do was not make too much of a scene of this video, but I seem to have taken 13 minutes already. So if I'm going to post up 13 minutes of video, what I ought to do is not so much show you my experience of Alibaba, but that's what seems to be happening. I want to go there and turn the camera on for a second. With any luck, the camera will come on the wrong way round. That's good. Alright, so I'm going to take you through the project in the same video. There is a factory with a waterfall and a river that runs by it. I estimate its production at 50 kilowatts continuous flow. It's not a 150 kilowatt station. It could possibly be a 100 kilowatt station at times, peaking of river flow. The fall is about 2 meters. It suggests that we need an Archimedes screw, which is on here. Anyway, the factory is close to a delivery point. This is the area of the factory. There is a three-phase connection to a substation here where 11,000 volts and 33,000 volts are transformed, and I own this property here personally, the field of study. This is called an electrical substation. This distance is literally one pole. What do I want to do in this building, which is listed? That means it's a historical building. It's owned by local government and there is no plan for it. That's to say there's a lot of space there, but nobody's got a plan to make a factory there any longer. Alright, what am I proposing to do? I'm proposing to take 50 kilowatts in and put it through some 48 volt, roughly 10 kilowatt hybrid inverters. This would be presumably an AC in here. I don't know whether we'd need to rectify it. To get you a three-phase, not really, I don't think it would be appropriate to put in a single-phase here, single-phase system in this factory. A three-phase 440 volt connected to the grid for metering and export. Alright, this is to establish this new workspace with modern electricity, because when the factory was built it didn't have electricity and there's no electricity infrastructure there very much, I should doubt, not if anything is going to happen on the factory floor. So get a whole set of them in, and then basically we've buffered the storage from the water wheel. Not too much power electronics control that's too difficult to set up, and three phases throughout the factory, exporting sockets, ring mains, etc. There you go, three phase wherever you need them, but you wouldn't have to install them now. You just go straight from that point to that point, because that's phase one. Alright, what was this diagram about, and why was that any different? This was the two phases. I'm going to jump out to this. 50 kilowatt coming in and three parallel inverters with with about 16 kilowatt hours of storage on each one. I made that was about 1 hour of production. Need to check all these figures a little bit more seriously. Oh yeah, okay, so then phase one is 50 kilowatts buffered and 50 kilowatts export, three phase on site. Good result to achieve for a factory installation. Here's some details about the connection to the grid that we'd have to have. The 1 kV transformer probably exists, but I doubt if it's suitable. Sorry, the 11 kV transformer, that should read. We've got to isolate it, synchronize, and have a remote disconnect. That turns so that basically, if we don't want to export electricity, we can turn it off. Right, I've jumped ahead a little bit, and actually I'm tired out from thinking about all this, but what I wanted to put on here was yes, I might as well do this one. This is probably the starting point. Once you've got the three phases established and some kind of robustness about this, you can add on extra batteries, alright, quite easily, and store them up, and they could be swapped in and out quite quick, really, or they could even be rack mounted en masse and then exported as a rack mount en masse with, the right lifting and shifting gear. You could turn them out with 3 months like historical performance, which would be no loss really. 3 months, what would that be? 90 cycles, 90 tested cycles daily charge and discharge. So, there's some common sense to having them racked up, ready to be dispatched, or, even if they're being put into a containerized power pack. I don't think I got capacity to handle containers on site. You could handle containers in the yard, but not containers on site. But here is the critical bit that I'm interested in, at least from a design of a modular power station point of view. Within the 48 volt pack, we've basically got 15S 3.2 volt lithium phosphate. And that means that there's 15 opportunities. I'm going to call it 15 opportunities. 15 opportunities to get 3.2 volts at some quite heavy amps. 20, I'm thinking, I believe. That potential difference is quite useful range when you're trying to split water up into hydrogen. Now, they do say don't mix water and electricity, but I do think we've got to get on and do some mixing of water and electricity in order to produce some hydrogen. And I'm thinking of how you could kind of interleave the hydrogen generation within the close proximity of the cells within the close proximity of the cells within the rack mount system. So that led me to think a bit about how the rack mount might actually work in a genuine rack mount assembly, and I think it led to this diagram on the last page, yes, that you would have standard units and modified, forgive me, you would have standard units and modified units rack mounted together, or you might even have like the battery and then the H2O generator directly above it and the H2O fuel cell directly above that. All of that, and of course then the hydrogen system would be would take off the fuel, the hydrogen generated for storage and compression possibly. I don't really anticipate the fuel cells being like very high priority in terms of phase 1 or 2. Phase 3. But it depends whether or not our Chinese partners wish to promote their fuel cells. I mean, it's not just me in charge of designing this. It's like a joint venture, is how I'm trying to see it. But the point is that within each of these 48 volt batteries, you've got 15 opportunities to collect some current and amps and volts at the right levels, I do believe. You're going to produce a certain amount of heat if the circuit is open, and how these 15 turn on and off, and whether you can control some big central way, can you, well, inside the 48 volt battery is for sure a battery management system, which I am sure has the capability of shutting down certain cells or not, I think. Very interested in how these are going to be serviced in the future. If you had 1600 of these battery packs and you had to go through them and 10 of them had failed out of 1600 after 5 years, What kind of regime are you going to have to keep that show on the road? In warranty and out of warranty. Warranty, gosh, how do you organise that? Right, that's quite enough rambling from me on a Sunday night. 25 bloody minutes.